Well, George Muller was a Christian evangelist in the 19th century, and he directed the Ashley Down orphanage in Bristol, England. During his life, he cared for over 10,000 orphans. Isn't that amazing? He established 117 schools, 117, and provided Christian education for more than 120,000 children. George was a man of prayer, and he was a man of faith. And he simply asked God to provide whatever the ministry needed right in time when the ministry needed it. There are many well-documented examples of how the Lord answered his prayers right in the midst of a trial and just in the nick of time. For example, one morning, all the children of the orphanage were sitting at the tables, ready to get their food, ready to eat breakfast, but George knew there was nothing in the cupboards whatsoever to feed them. Zero. They were empty. But immediately after they bowed their heads and said grace, right after they looked up, the baker knocked at the door with sufficient bread to feed every single child in the place. And at the same time, the milkman's cart broke down outside. And for fear of not being able to deliver that milk anywhere else, he came into the orphanage before it spoiled and shared it with the children. George Muller once said, quote, "God delights to increase the faith of his children. Instead of wanting no trials before victory, we ought to be willing to receive them from God's hand as means. Trials, obstacles, difficulties, and sometimes defeats are the food of our faith." End quote. Some of us walked in here feeling like we're in a trial. We have contact with many people in our church, of course, and as a pastor, I can tell you there are many people in our church going through trials. In fact, most every person that you see, when you see a person, a human being, you ought to know that there's probably some inner struggle that they're experiencing that maybe only a few or maybe even no one knows anything about. Every person battles. And George Muller articulated an important biblical principle. It's not that there's something wrong with praying to be delivered from trials. That's good, isn't it, to do? I do it regularly. I'm sort of a wimp when it comes to trials. My first prayer is, Lord, deliver me from this trial. I don't like what I'm experiencing. Help me, I'm your child. Nothing wrong with doing that. It's simply this, though. If God doesn't deliver you, it means he wants you to trust him through it. Though the trial may seem like a total negative when you're in it and overwhelming to you, it's actually food to nourish your trust in him. Your struggles are a means to a greater end that God has. That when you come out the other side of it, you're stronger. You know, when you get through that battle, you're able the next time to rely on God in a bigger way. And that's our group prayer right now, that all of us would live by faith in Jesus Christ, that each and every day we would trust him more, we would rely on him more for whatever he's calling us to do, that our faith wouldn't simply be a decision we made in the past, but it'd be an active, living faith, trusting in God moment by moment, even every single day. We're in a sermon series this fall called Living Faith. The first week we learned that Christian faith can be defined as relying on the person and the work and the promises of Jesus Christ. It involves reward and it precedes understanding. The last 2 weeks we've been looking at all these examples of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. It's just relentless, isn't it? Even this morning, did you see it? By faith, by faith, by faith, by faith. All these examples of human faith for us. There's lessons to be learned from definitions of faith. There's also wonderful insights to have related to examples, human beings expressing their faith. We learned that Abel is an example that faith speaks beyond our life. Enoch's life shows us that faith pleases God. Noah revealed to us that faith prepares for what's coming in the future. Abraham and Sarah's lives, aren't they great? Examples of faith that follows God's command into the unknown, receives power really for the impossible, and desires heaven more than earth. We continue this exploration into examples of faith with 3 lessons from 5 men that the Bible refers to as our patriarchs: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses. Now, patriarchy is often viewed negatively today in our culture, but with respect to faith, the Bible speaks of it in a positive sense, that these men were our forefathers in the faith. They went before us and have examples for us to follow, for us to learn from them. So first, I want you to notice, number 1, from the lives of these men, that faith trusts God for resurrection. So being a Christian, here's what it means. It means having faith in Jesus. That is, having faith looking backwards at his crucifixion on the cross as the only way we can be right with God. Faith is also trusting God right now that, sometimes we wear crosses where Jesus is on the cross, which I don't think is a terrible thing to do, but, he got up from the cross, didn't he? He rose from the dead, so he's alive. Jesus is alive right now. So our faith now is to trust in him for power to battle sin, to overcome it, to become more like him. And then faith also relies on his return in the future to deliver us, aren't you looking forward to this? To deliver us resurrection bodies like his. If we're alive when he returns, in other words, if he returns soon, it says that we will be transformed and we'll get bodies like his body. If we've died and gone to heaven, and then he returns, get this, we return with him. And he delivers us new bodies in that process with everyone else. So the past work of Jesus on the cross, his past resurrection, his current reign right now, as well as his return in the future, did you know this? They're all foretold, it's fascinating, in the life of Abraham 4,000 years ago. I want you to see particularly how Abraham had faith. He trusted God for resurrection. Look at Hebrews 11, 17 through 19 again. It says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Now, the details of these events can be found in Genesis, if you turn back, in Genesis chapter 22. Here's the short version. God promised Abraham and Sarah that they would have a son, and through that son, they'd have children and grandchildren and grandchildren. In fact, nations would come from that son, kings even. They would have so many descendants from that particular son that they wouldn't be able to count them. They'd be like the stars in the sky or the sand on the seashore. And that was a promise that would be hard to believe if you're anyone, but Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90, so it was an impossible situation. They both were as good as dead, so God was bringing life, abundant life, from a dead place. But they both believed. Sarah, it says, had faith in the Lord, and she received power to conceive as a result of her faith. And that boy was born, and they named him Isaac, which means he will laugh. Why? I think it was because he was a walking miracle of joy. Don't you think they both looked, every time they saw him, they're like, Isaac! Don't you think? Incredible. So it must have been totally confusing to Abraham. Are you tracking here? It was confusing when God told him to sacrifice Isaac. Now, while that brings an ethical problem to our minds, doesn't it? Who is this God who's commanding child sacrifice? Well, that comes into our minds. It's not the focus of Abraham's dilemma. And I just want to say on that ethical dilemma for 21st century folk, It's worth noting that back in ancient times, this would not have necessarily been something of a surprise. In ancient pagan religions particularly, child sacrifice was sometimes part of what they did. You know, the past is much more brutal than we think. Furthermore, with the evil of unrestricted abortion in our day, 21st century folks ought to be careful not to throw stones from the proverbial glass house, right? When reading this account of something that happened in 18th century BC. There's brutal things happening on the planet today. That aside, Abraham's crisis of faith was not about if God was evil for commanding him to sacrifice Isaac. His crisis of faith was what? It was in this apparent contradiction of God's commands. God promised to bring nations from that son. That's one promise. And then he said, kill the son before he's married and has offspring. That makes no sense. There's a contradiction. Now, if you don't know the story, God told Abraham not to sacrifice his son Isaac at the last moment and revealed a male sheep in the thickets on the mountain that Abraham would sacrifice instead. The ram would take the place of Isaac. No doubt in his mind, that was a foreshadowing of something else, I think. There's no doubt in my mind that's a foreshadowing of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. You see, God was clearly communicating to all of humanity there that he's not the kind of God that requires our sons to be sacrificed. Instead, he's the kind of God who sacrificed his own son. Jesus died in our place. That's why Jesus is called the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. I also think the situation, there's much here, isn't there? The situation points to God's desire for us to value him more than anything else. That's genuine faith. That you and I love God more than anything else. Abraham was tested in that way, and he passed the test. He proved that he loved God more than anything else. But the main point of Hebrews chapter 11 here is that faith trusts God for resurrection. Abraham believed God's word that many nations would come from this one son, from Isaac. And since God told him to sacrifice Isaac, he believed that meant that he was going to raise him from the dead after he was sacrificed. See, Genesis 22:5, look at it. It reads, "Then Abraham said to his young men, the servants, 'Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you.'" You see, in his heart, Abraham gave the boy up to God prior to that, walking up to that mountain. He had resigned in his heart to give him up to God. Why? Because he had faith. He had faith that God would fulfill his promise to make that very son into a great nation. Therefore, he thought, after I sacrifice him, God is going to resurrect him, and we're both going to walk down that mountain. By the way, do you know that he was strengthened in that moment by a past reliance on God? Wasn't he? Don't you think that Abraham in that moment, when God told him to do something, remembered Isaac? That they were as good as dead? 190? God brought life? Don't you think that he was strengthened, just like George Muller said? We're strengthened when we trust in God for future challenges. No doubt that was true here. When God told Abraham not to go through with it, he received his son back from the dead, figuratively speaking. And the scripture speaks to us today, doesn't it, about faith? Faith trusts God for resurrection. Faith isn't merely about this world. Faith looks forward to the future, into the next world. Faith, it faces death itself head on and counts on God to bring us through death into everlasting life. And not some mediocre existence that's like less than this one. We're not getting a downgrade, like we're spirits floating around in a cloud forever. No, faith trusts God for glory. One day, everyone who has faith in Jesus will receive a body like the one Jesus had since his resurrection. Aren't you grateful for that promise? I had a birthday this week. Thank you. Clock's turning. Body is breaking down. Amen. Everyone, over 30 probably knows this. For me, it felt like, I hit 25 and then it just keeps going down. So don't you love this promise? Resurrection, imperishable. That's what we're getting. Not like these that decline over time. We're getting a model that's imperishable. It's also completely honorable, the resurrection body you're getting. It's without sin. Every bit of sin in you will be eliminated and it will never return. You will never think things that you regret. You will never do things that you regret. You will never desire anything that you regret. Your body and soul together in the resurrection will be completely without sin. It's going to be unbelievably powerful as well, not weak like these. It's powerful. It's made, it says, with the stuff of heaven, not the dust of earth. It's supernatural. It's not of this world. There's nothing like it in this world that you can see. It's immortal, it's everlasting, and it's glorious. Christian, you're getting a new model. And you'll be with all of those who have faith in the past, and you'll recognize them. You'll see the ones you love. I can't wait to see what you folks look like. You know how you feel when you get a new hairdo? I don't know how that feels, as you can see. You know how you feel when you get a new hairdo? Or when you're driving around in a new car? Or you have a new toy or a great new job? Or you're in a new house? My goodness, it's that times a trillion. That's what you're going to experience. That's what faith is about. It trusts God for resurrection. That's the kind of faith that God wants from us. That's number one. Number two, second, faith entrusts the next generation to God. So one of the challenging things, I think, about death, one of the challenging things, there's many challenging things about it. One of the many challenging things is that you say goodbye to the ones that you love. We believe we'll see each other again when we're resurrected. We have that confidence, that hope, that faith, but I think it's still excruciatingly difficult to say goodbye to people as you exit this life for the next. It's particularly difficult with our children and our grandchildren, if we have those, isn't it? As parents, we spend so much time, energy, effort. We love our kids. We love our grandkids. We have so much of ourselves invested in them. We love them beyond measure. We want to know that they're going to be okay. We need to know that. We experience some of that when we entrust them as they grow up, when they leave for college or when they move out of the house. But it's a whole different level of trust in God, isn't it? Imagine yourself around a hospital bed with your kids and grandkids as you exit this world. It's a whole different level of trust to look them in the eye and trust God that they're going to be okay. I'm really grateful for the Bible in a lot of ways, but I'm especially thankful that God addresses our greatest human challenges head on in this book, aren't you? Look at how Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph all ended their life in Hebrews 11:20 through 22. This is how they concluded their days. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. Now, the detailed accounts of these three men are in Genesis 27, 48, and 50, if you'd like to read about them. In 27, Isaac didn't simply ask the Lord to be good to his sons. He blessed them with the promises of God for them. Thereby, what he was doing was he was entrusting their care to God himself. Jacob did something similar with the sons of Joseph. It's fascinating to me, by the way. There's many reasons why Jacob is, communicated to us in the Bible in, a lot of different ways. But I think one of them is that he was the least virtuous of the patriarchs. But did you know that in the Bible, it refers to God as the God of Jacob much more than the God of Abraham, Isaac, Joseph, or Moses even? It's almost as if God is emphasizing to us that he's the God even of Jacob. That's how gracious he is. That's how merciful he is. So if you feel like you're not very virtuous, welcome to the club. God is still your God if you have faith in Jesus. And if not, if you don't have faith in Jesus, God can still be your God. Because he's the God of Jacob, for goodness sakes. Of course he can be your God, no matter what you did in the past. And particularly on this topic, if you feel like you've blown it as a mom or a dad or a grandparent, if you feel like you have all kinds of regrets, again, welcome to the club. And these verses are meant to encourage us, aren't they? Jacob did it. You then, even you, even me, we can speak the promises of Jesus over our family. We can bless them with his word. We can bless them with our prayers. We can entrust the next generation to them. God is the God of Jacob, that guy. Of course he's going to be faithful and true to you. Have no doubts about what he has said will happen. And though Joseph's words simply seem to be about his burial in the promised land, it's interesting that he was speaking about the Exodus. He was prophesying about what was going to happen in the future in the Exodus. And the direction to carry his bones back there gave evidence that he had faith. He really believed that God would take care of his family and the whole nation when he left, even though they were in Egypt at the time. All three of these patriarchs, these forefathers of the faith, firmly believed that death was not going to be the end of them. They would gain heaven immediately upon their last breath. So they would breathe their last, and then they would breathe in glory. They would close their eyes on earth, and they would open them to spectacular glories that we have not seen yet. During their life, they spoke with confidence about what would happen after they died, not just in that way, but also in the ways on earth, that God would take care of what was going on earth. So their faith was stronger even than death. It overcame death in that way. That's what faith is about. It trusts God for resurrection and trusts the next generation to God. That's number two. Third and finally today, I want you to see that faith fears God above all. So us revering the Lord more than everything else is part of what faith is about. So when you value God's opinion more than the opinion of any other creature, any other person, any other human, any other angel, even yourself, when you do that, that's an expression of your faith. That's the kind of faith Moses had. I want you to look at Hebrews chapter 11, verses 23 through 28. It tells of this story of Moses, in a short version, and it particularly focuses on this concept of the fear of the Lord, a good kind of fear. It starts in verse 23, it says, "By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them." So among these patriarchs, Moses has the most significant amount of biblical data about him. His life starts in Exodus chapter 2, and his death is recorded in Deuteronomy chapter 34. So he's an important figure in the Old Testament. He's also a very important figure in Hebrews. He's mentioned in this book 11 times. In some ways, his faith is described like that of Abel and Enoch. In other ways, his faith is described like Abraham and Sarah. But what binds these four brief accounts here in verses 23 through 28 is this idea of the fear of the Lord. Did you notice? At his birth, his parents expressed faith. They put him in a basket in the Nile River. And that faith feared God more than Pharaoh. They didn't fear Pharaoh. They feared God. That's why they put him in the basket. They didn't fear that command from Pharaoh to kill all the firstborn Hebrew children. So they obeyed God's direction regarding the sanctity of life. When Moses became an adult, he had faith like his parents. Though he was considered a member of the royal house, he chose to leave the royal house and live in slavery. Why? Why did the wealthy young man leave the lifestyle of the rich and famous to devote himself to God's work among the poor and the oppressed? It wasn't because he was a good person. It doesn't say that. It says because he had faith. Because he feared God more than humans. That's faith. Did you see how striking this is? Did you see this? He valued God so much that he considered the mistreatment involved in following God in his day to be more valuable than the greatest wealth in all of the earth. To Moses, getting persecuted was more valuable than all the wealth of the world. That's incredible faith. Why did he think that? Why does faith generate that kind of perspective? Well, because the rewards of God last forever. Someone needs to hear this today. The thrill of sin is here today and gone tomorrow. It's fleeting. Sometimes it just doesn't even last a day. Faith involves reward, the reward of delayed gratification, the reward of pleasing God, which lasts forever. Moses also left Egypt because he feared God more than Pharaoh. That's what binds these verses together, the fear of God, which is, it's not a bad kind of fear, it's a good kind of fear. You know, when you fear God, you value his smile upon you. You value pleasing him more than anything else. No matter who is threatening you, no matter who is angry with you, no matter who is oppressing you, no matter who is persecuting you, you value God more than them. You fear the Lord more than you fear them. And that's what Moses did. He endured hardship because he could see through the eyes of faith the invisible God and the rewards he provides. And in the Passover, when he put that lamb's blood on the doorpost of his house, as God instructed, he again showed that he feared the Lord more than Pharaoh. He had faith in God that all of his people who did that would be saved. Do you see this connection between fearing the Lord and faith? So to fear the Lord is to value his word more than anyone else's, even than your own. To have faith is to rely on that word. How are you going to rely on that word unless you value that word? The less you value it, the less faith you'll have. The more you value his word, the more faith you will have. So let me ask you, who do you fear the most? Do you know you can trade all of your fears for one fear? Do you realize that? You fear the Lord the most, man, all of your other fears will diminish. Right? You value him, you do what he says. Who do you want to please the most? Is it a boss, an authority at work? The in crowd, a friend, a family member, a spouse, your child? Right now, I'm really tempted to please our puppies the most because they're so cute and they're also relentless. Who do you want to please the most? Is it you? Do you respect yourself more than God? If you want to have faith, you want to grow in faith, the most important person in your heart must be Jesus Christ. Trade all your fears for the fear of him. See, faith in Jesus trusts God for resurrection, entrusts the next generation to God, and fears God above all else. May you have faith in Jesus. That's the lessons from Hebrews chapter 11 from these 5 patriarchs for us today. Well, legend has it that a man was lost in the desert, and he was literally dying for a drink of water. And he stumbled upon an old shack, broken down, windowless, roof caving in, weather beaten. And he looked under the porch so that he could get some relief from the shade, little relief from the heat of the desert. And as he glanced around, he saw an old rusty pipe, a pump coming out of the ground about 15 feet away. He stumbled over to it and grabbed the handle, and he began to pump it up and down and up and down, and nothing came out. He almost lost hope. Disappointed, he staggered back away from it. And then he noticed over to the side an old jug. He looked at it, he picked it up, he wiped away the dirt and the dust, and he read the message on it. It said, "You have to prime the pump with all this water in the jug, my friend. P.S. Be sure to fill the jug again before you leave." He popped the cork out of the jug, and sure enough, it was full of water. Suddenly, he was faced with a decision. If he drank the water, he could live. But if he poured out all the water on the rusty pump, maybe it would yield, fresh, cool water from down deep in the well, not this hot water in the jug. He would get all the water he wanted. He could take a shower even. He studied the possibility of both options. What should he do? Prime that pump and take on the fresh, cool water to drink and bathe in? Or just drink? Ignore the message and try to survive? Should he waste all that water on the hopes of something that someone wrote long ago that he didn't even know who that person wrote it? Well, reluctantly almost, he poured the water onto the pump and into the pump. Then he grabbed that handle and began to pump. Squeak, squeak, squeak. Nothing coming out. Squeak, squeak, squeak. A little began to dribble out in a small stream, and finally it gushed. To his relief, fresh, cool water poured out of that rusty pump. So eagerly he filled the jug and he drank from it, and then he drank from it another time. He poured it all over himself. He washed himself, and then he filled it to the top, popped the cork back on, and added his own note. Believe me, it really works. You have to give it all away before you can get anything back. Now, some of you are wondering how he got a pen and everything. It's legend. And the point is, sometimes God asks us to lay it all on the line, to go all in. Past the point of no return. To come to the very end of ourselves. Giving up everything to Him. Everything in our hearts, everything in our lives, so that we're in a situation where if God doesn't come through, all hope is lost. You see, it's in those moments, in those days, in those seasons, in those years that the Lord will meet you in the most profound way. And if you're there right now, or even in a place that's slightly less dramatic than that, just remember, He's good. He's good. He's God. And you can trust Him with everything you have.